Hi, I'm Bonnie Browning with the American Quilter Society, and I'm here today at AQS Quilt Week in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and we have another winner. Beth
you.
Ann Nemish lives in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and she won first place in the long arm quilted wall quilt.
Yes, I did. Thank
Congratulations.
You. Oh, I was so excited to get the call last night from Andrea. It's one of my favorite
and isn't
things.
it fun when it's close to home, too?
It's wonderful because then I get to come and talk with you.
Yes.
So
Well,
great.
so I know everybody out there really wants to know what you do to make these beautiful quilts. So let's start with the fabric.
This fabric is the Kaufman Radiance fabric, which is a silk and cotton blend. And I really do enjoy working with it for its sheen and its luster. I think it's really beautiful.
And is it easy to work with? Usually people think of silk as
not.
kind of hard.
It's easy to work with if you back it. You have to back it with a fine fusible interfacing. Otherwise, it slithers like a nightgown, and it's very tough.
Well,
But-
that's a key point everybody needs to know.
Yes, and
isn't it?
especially when you rely on marking the way that I do. This is fully marked, pre-quilting, with the exception of the backfill, and the marking will really distort the fabric without that backing.
Okay, so how do you mark it?
Well, I do a pattern, a full-size pattern, and then I pin the fabric directly to the pattern, and I mark with a blue washout pin using a light table. And I actually break my dining room table in half and put a big piece of plastic over the opening and shine some lights up from the bottom, and there we go, big giant
And
light
then you
table.
can do the whole thing all in one spot then, mostly,
Well,
huh?
pretty big pieces, yeah,
Sure.
it works out really well. And then I do the blue washout pen, which on blue was a little challenging. On other colors, it works a little bit better. And then when the quilt is completed, it has to be soaked and blocked.
Okay, and we want to make sure that people understand that they do have to really soak it in water.
And rinse it a couple of times too. I actually had an interesting thing happen, and I thought I'd ruined the quilt. I soaked it, pulled it out kind of in a U shape, and then, began the process of drying it and blocking it. And when it was dry, there was a strange blue streak that ran across the quilt, and momentary panic ensued. And there was nothing on the back, though, that could have been a bleed, and if it was a bleed, it would have not looked like this line. And eventually, I figured out that that was the drainage point where I lifted the quilt, and all of the chemicals of the blue washout pen had gone to the lowest point and sort of gathered there, so I hadn't rinsed it thoroughly enough.
So it meant another bath.
It had a second bath and a second blocking, which of course means crawling around on the floor a second time. So yeah, you do have to actually, if you use a lot of mark-out, you have to wash more than once and clean the water and do it again. Otherwise, you'll scare yourself.
All right, well, okay, so then the next point is the quilting is beautiful, of
Thank
course,
you.
but let's talk about the thread that you use.
I tend to use superior threads predominantly. I really like the sheen of like the Magnifico product I'm really happy with, and then I do the backfill work with the silk typically. And so that's what this particular quilt has.
And are you using the same thread top and bottom?
I do not use the same thread top and bottom. I use, for example, a bottom line, a very thin on the back, but I do match the threads. Now this quilt's the whole cloth, obviously, it's already matched, but even in my daily life when I quilt, I match the top threads to the bottom threads, always. So I don't want to have the stress of those little pokies.
Well, then the next comes the design. Where do those come from?
That is a very organic process, the creative process. This particular quilt was inspired by a beach trip henna tattoo of a peacock that I got on my arm. And those often have a lot of paisleys in them, the way that the henna tattoos are. And I also have some sari fabrics, some Indian fabrics, and the peacock is the national bird of India. So those kind of things sort of pinged around in my mind. Gelled a little bit. And I like the ribbon edges of the sari, so that's kind of where the ribbony components came from. And the peacocks here are making sort of a yin and a yang symbol as they sort of overlap each other here in the center of the quilt. There's about 2 different styles of peacocks going on. The ones in the middle have a very individual feather, and then the ones in the border elements are more related to like a classically quilted feather, like a heirloom style feather. And so I've tried to make sure that those elements repeat each other multiple times so that nothing stands alone by itself. So I have this style of feather repeating in the ribbon, and then I have this style of feather repeating in the final border. Yeah, just to repeat the design process, because that kind of makes for a solid design.
Well, and one thing that really makes those stand out is when you do this straight line quilting in between. So talk a little bit about that.
Yes, well, I do a lot of pictorial work. This is no no exception. You know, you need to be able to see that these are peacocks. They're not just random groups of feathers. And your human eye is very good at differentiating curves from lines. And so having a linear backfill against something like this really helps your brain pick out that there's something going on here that's important to pay attention to, and it has an actual shape to it. So that's
Well,
really helpful. And there's a very interesting optical illusion that's created when you quilt vertically and then horizontally, where it makes the chevron. It's not difficult to do. It creates an optical illusion of light, which really switches it back and forth.
And
which is
actually,
neat.
for somebody that's just starting to work on some background fills,
It's
that's
actually pretty easy. It's
isn't it?
reasonably easy to do.
Yes.
Maybe not so much on a 1/16 of an inch scale, but yes, the straight line quilting does work pretty well. Yeah.
All right, now the edge is what I want to know about. I'm all about borders, so
Yes.
let's talk about the edge of your quilt.
The edge of this quilt has two different techniques. The first is a beaded piping, which is a technique that I've kind of innovated and I've been using on a lot of my quilts. And it is a very laborious process of enclosing pearls, actual beads, inside of a sleeve of fabric and individually tying them off one by one. And that is installed on the quilt much like regular piping would be. And then these little tongues was inspired by the edges of the peacocks, you know, the paisleyness of them. But I used to make penny rugs years ago. Do you remember penny rugs,
Yes,
little
so
wool penny rugs?
That's very common.
A kind of a thing. And so these were actually individually made tongues where I used a tongue depressor, a wooden tongue depressor, and they're individually made, completely separate.
Turned inside out?
Turned inside out, stuffed with batting, quilted with a little circle, and then one by one laid out on the edge of the quilt before basting it, and then finishing it with a facing to the back so that it is completely enclosed.
So let me just ask you, before you turn that, do you trim really close or do you clip?
I grade them.
You grade them.
Yes, so I
Okay.
hold the scissors at a tight angle so that it's a bulky finish no matter what you do, but I do try to reduce the, you know,
The bulk a little
the
bit.
shelf qualities of it. Yes.
All right, now you have that available in your book, right?
I do. I made a book on these types of finish details. It's called The Devil in the Details because it's just so tough.
And it's self-published?
It's self-published, yes. It's available on my website for people who are interested in it.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to tell us about it?
Nothing that particularly comes to mind other than, you know, we had talked briefly about the blocking and that it was, this quilt, like all the quilts I do, machine quilting warps them quite a bit. And it is very important to understand how to block and to solidly block
So how do you
your
do
quilts. Well, after you're getting it wet, I have two, I call them blocking boards, but they're just boards from Home Depot that are the
Like foam boards?
Foam boards, yeah, thick foam boards, and marked with a straight 90-degree intersection at one corner. And I use a combination of a laser level and lining them up and measuring from corner to corner to make sure it's perfectly square, and then pin around the edges. And as it dries, it shrinks and tightens up, and it becomes perfectly flat. And it's something that really puts a polish on a finished quilt, especially for show, so that it hangs nice and straight. And,
Well,
sometimes
and-
you have to do it again, you know, because they get crumpled sometimes in shipping.
Well, yes, and even after it's been to a few shows, you may have to do
You
it
have to
again,
freshen it
don't
up.
you?
Yes, you
Yes.
do sometimes. Yep.
Well, congratulations. It's
Thank
a thrill
you.
for me to get to meet you and see your beautiful work up close.
Thanks.
And we hope that you'll enter your quilts in the next AQS Quilt Week contest and that you could be standing right here for an interview next time.
Thank you.
See you at AQS Quilt Week.